his military is decimated. His army is decimated. And they are not going to go charging into NATO territory to expect to win.
Hi, welcome to Superpowers, the future of global security here on Times Radio. I'm James Heapy, and this week I am joined by General Philip Breedlove. General Philip is a former US Air Force general officer, but at the end of his career, he was also the Supreme Allied Commander Europe, which is the senior military appointment within NATO, making him the commander of all Allied forces in the European theatre. General Breedlove, welcome. If I may, can I just start by getting you to cast your Sacker eye over your country's policy to Europe and NATO? I think probably best summed up as tough love. Many would say long overdue, but with it is the threat of US disengagement from the theatre that you commanded and know so well. What's your take on it all?
Well, first of all, James, thanks for having me aboard, and I'm happy to be with you this morning. So I think that what we need to remember before we talk, just for a minute, remember how successful this alliance has been over the past 75 years. Probably the most successful military alliance in the history of the world. And yes, we had a few bumps in the road in Yugoslavia and Kosovo, but what we have managed to do over the past 75 years is keep world peace. We had had 2 world wars before the formation of this alliance. And in the main, it has done magnificently. And I think that what we also need to understand is something I've talked about and written about, which I believe this alliance is more important in the next 75 years than it was in the last 75 years. Our enemies are more indistinct. Our enemies fight us below the line. Some people call it hybrid war. Some people call it gray zone war. I like to just call it war below the lines because we are definitely fighting, but we're just not doing it with bombs and missiles yet. And so we need an alliance that has a backbone and has a moral compass to help guide us the next 75 years. So where are we find ourselves now? I like to remind people that we have an administration now that we had before. If you remember, we had an administration with a policy some time ago, and that policy was pretty rough. We used to talk then about mean tweets and so forth. And during that administration, I like to point people to facts because facts are sometimes inconvenient, but they are really important. And here are 3 facts about the last time we had this approach to Europe. During that 4 years, the number of American troops in Europe increased. During that 4 years, the amount of American investment in infrastructure, military supporting infrastructure in Europe increased. And during that time, the number of large force employment exercises, Trident Juncture to point to one, increased. So while we had a lot of really tough talk and some pretty tough wrangling going on, what actually happened, factually happened in Europe is our troop numbers increased, our investments increased, and our number of big, large force employment exercises increased. So, yes, there were some really turbulent times, and yes, we had some policies that were a bit abrasive, but in the end, America remained a strong ally in the alliance. I'm here to tell you that that's what I expect this time.
I think the Clinton memo on the pivot to the Pacific came before Trump, and indeed whilst you were Sacker. So this is not a new direction of travel in terms of US focus on the
No.
Pacific theater.
And may I just say that NATO had an intense interest in the Pacific as well. I like to tell the story that it was the 4th day I was on the job as the SACEUR, and a package came in and they felt like they needed to explain it. And it was me not approving because the nations can individually do what they want, but me accepting that a big contingent of NATO Navy was going to the Pacific for the Rim of the Pacific exercise called RIMPAC, the largest Pacific exercise, and it was then carried out every 2 years. And I asked for the history, and the history was that NATO had long been sending large flotillas to participate. NATO, read the EU, read Europe, has always been interested in maintaining the free flow of goods and trade in the Pacific. So America sort of made a more pronounced out there public announcement. But in fact, NATO had been showing a lot of interest in the Pacific for a long time.
Well, I mean, I wanted to ask you later in our conversation about the indivisibility of the Euro-Atlantic and the Indo-Pacific, but since we're onto it, let's do that now. I think people too often forget that the US maintained a formidable Pacific fleet and air forces in Alaska and along the Pacific coast, and US Army and Marine presence in the Pacific throughout the Cold War, because even in that competition with Russia, it was expected that it would spill over into the Pacific theater. And
Yeah,
my
it was.
sense,
May I add one dynamic that you didn't mention? I mean, the naval and the air forces that were maintained in the Pacific were very much about the free flow of goods and trade. The army forces that were in the Pacific back then were really focused on North Korea. Now we have begun to shift that focus a little bit towards China, but the Army's presence is really about defending Korea. And who knows, if China was to go after Taiwan, would they not take their surrogate in North Korea and send them south to complicate matters? But we all know and understand, and this is not a slam on any of our services. I had 5 major joint engagements in my life, and I commanded joint troops. So I think joint, but we all kind of understand that the fight in the Pacific, if it's against China, is going to largely be an air and naval fight, unless either Russia or China takes the opportunity to kick off the peninsula, and then the U.S. Army is going to be decisively engaged there.
well, I would imagine that when you were SACEUR, you had a very strong relationship with the Indo-PACOM commander at the time as well. But it just seems to me that with the relationship between Russia and China having developed in the way that it has, and Russia now effectively being a client of China, and then all the things around an opening up of the Northern Sea route, that those two theatres are even less divisible now than they might have been 15, 20 years ago. And I'm convinced that if a competition between China and the US kicks off in the Pacific, Russia will be used as an off-axis challenge to the US in the Atlantic, and therefore SACEUR has a role in the China competition, whether NATO likes it or not.
So I hate to keep sort of adding, never correcting, but adding to your thought. Uh,
Correct
as
away. You're the four-star general.
as the SACEUR back then, not only did I have this relationship with the Indo-Pacific, but I had a huge relationship with CENTCOM because the border was of Turkey was involved in a war. I mean, it
Yeah.
was spilling over into Turkey. We had the remember if you remember the Southern Fence operation where we had NATO, not U.S. but NATO patriots on the Turkish border, and later to be the SecDef, my good friend Lloyd Austin, who was my compatriot commander there. He and I shared intelligence assets. We shared intelligence. We actually shared forces sometimes. So to your point, the indivisibility of our world, bigger than just Europe and PACOM, is incredible. Even today, we see EUCOM involved in support to what's going on in Iran and in the Middle East. And so the idea that we would be able to selectively say we're going to fight this one now, you guys take it easy, that really never did exist. It certainly does not exist now. I believe, as you surmise, the interconnectivity of this is quite out there. I will tell you this, and it may dip into the rest of your program, but Mr. Putin knows without a shadow of a doubt right now he cannot defeat NATO because his military is decimated, his army is decimated, and they are not going to go charging into NATO territory to expect to win. So I see Mr. Putin in a world conflagration along the lines of what you described, possibly as a secondary player in something that China would kick off or Russia would kick off vis-a-vis North Korea.
And yet, whilst we're agreed on the indivisibility of the theatres, and I take your point entirely that CENTCOM is no less connected, it feels like the DoD is being forced into a decision around the rebalancing of US forces, and the narrative in NATO is the Europeans need to look after Europe so the US can pivot elsewhere. Now, I take your point that actually, for all the rhetoric, what has actually been disinvested from the theatre, but it just feels like the DoD, possibly because of what's available in the inventory, is trying to rebalance to focus on the Pacific at the expense of EUCOM and CENTCOM.
So this narrative has been out there, and they are doing this rebalancing in the Pentagon right now. And that rebalancing a month ago might have had a different focus than it might now this week or next week based on the intransigence of Mr. Putin. The world and some very important Western leaders are finally getting around to the fact that this guy is a war criminal. He cannot be trusted. He never has been, and he never will be a partner in peace in Ukraine. His focus on Ukraine is not going to be affected by any of these people in the West who are trying, and God bless them for trying. It's important, but the bottom line is, this man intends to subjugate the country of Ukraine and turn it back into the territory of Ukraine as a part of Russia. And he laid that out, if you remember, in the two documents that he gave us right before this last phase of the war started. I'll take one more umbrage and then I'll shut up. There's a lot of people that call this war 3.5 years long. This war is 11 years long.
Indeed.
Russia invaded Crimea and subjugated it. Then they invaded the Donbass and subjugated it. And then we had a line of contact that was warm, if not hot, for some 6 intervening years where Russians were killing Ukrainians and Ukrainians were killing Russians. And then we had a third hot phase of this war that people like to call the large-scale invasion part of the war. But the fact of the matter is, Mr. Putin has been myopically focused on subjugating the people of Ukraine for over 11 years. And I think that the Western world is finally coming to grips with that.
Couldn't agree with you more. It baffles me that anybody has not seen Putin for who he is. He's been very explicit, as you rightly note, about everything that he was intending. And the idea that he is reconcilable to a different outcome if only there was a better deal done seems a nonsense to me. But is $320 million worth of second-hand Bradley infantry fighting vehicles and some Hawk missiles enough to tip the balance?
Well, no, but I will tell you this. They love the Bradley. In
Yeah.
fact, I would tell you in my conversations at the grassroots level, even below kind of where I normally talk, there are 2 vehicles they love over there now: the German Gepard and the Bradley, because the Bradley is really the workhorse on the battlefield for them. And the idea that that small chain gun on the top can tear up a tank is pretty impressive, but it also tears up any other kind of vehicle out there, and it moves rapidly and protects way better than the M113s that I drove when I was serving with our U.S. Army. And then, as we've come to know now, this layered air defense that we need to defeat Russia's main weapon now. Russia, it's pretty clear Russia's not going to win a land battle with Ukraine. Ukraine has thwarted them. And, if you listen to the right the pretty sane voices, they've had over a million casualties in this war. I mean, it's phenomenal. But if you look at the requirement of that layered defense, we used to talk about strategic impacts from missiles, ballistic missiles, then operational impacts from cruise missiles and large drones, and then we talk about tactical drones, the smaller drones out there, the Shaheeds and others like that. Now we're starting to talk about that next category of sub-tactical drones. And those sub-tactical drones, we cannot afford to be shooting IRSTs and Patriots at. But now what we're learning is the Ukrainians are having immense success with the Gepard and that kind of vehicle. And so I'm sorry for interrupting, but you brought up the Bradley, and they really love the way the Bradley works on the battlefield for them, and they're really fallen in love with a Gepard.
So what's the theory of victory? I was sat watching or participating in war games with your successor Chris Cavoli and his staff when we were thinking.
Brilliant commander, by the way.
I could not agree with you more. I'm a huge fan of his. The and the theory of victory that we had when I was last in these war games was that we could, theory one, that we were actually able to sprint at creating, core of Ukrainian army capability that could do NATO tactics and achieve a massive territorial gain that might bring about a military end to the war. That proved to be a bit of a Hail Mary. So then the theory of victory was that a sustained effort over 5 years would transform the Ukrainian military into a NATO-grade military that could then overwhelm the Russians. But I don't think that the aid program since then has matched that ambition, and they are not far enough into that journey for that to be realistic. So I'm sort of scratching around, and I'm not in those meetings anymore. I don't see what the theory of victory now is.
So I'm going to disappoint you terribly here, because my theory of victory is way different than that. My theory of victory is when Mr. Putin is convinced he will not win this war, that will be the first step in a victory.
Yeah.
And he right now absolutely believes he can win this war, because when he looks to the West, he sees soft underbelly. Remember the story that is attributed to Lenin. I'm not a historian, but the story attributed to Lenin is, when you approach your enemy, fix your bayonet and press your bayonet into your enemy's belly. And if it's soft, keep pressing. If it's hard, pull back and reconsider. We have had a soft belly to Russia since 2008. Since 2008, we continue to reward bad behavior. When you reward bad behavior, you get more bad behavior. So the first step, in my mind, towards victory has nothing to do with kit or tactics or anything. The first step towards victory is when Western leaders, and that would include and would be demanding to include the U.S. president, when those leaders stand up and say, Mr. Putin, stop. Don't ask him, tell him, stop. And then the second part of that is loud, proud on every TV, every internet node, everywhere you can. You will not win this war. We will assure you do not win this war. So that's the first step. Mr. Putin has to look to the West and see the hard belly and have to pull that bayonet back and reconsider. And then enabling the army of Ukraine to be more NATO-like in certain areas.
Yeah.
We in NATO need to become more Ukraine-like in certain areas, but Ukraine's Air Force needs to be a Western Air Force. Ukraine's Navy has whipped the Black Sea Fleet, and they have zero capital ships. But we do need to give them a better capability to defend their coastlines and hold the routes of trade open so that Ukraine can come back. So I'm sorry, again, I'm running off, but the bottom line is, in my mind, in Phil Breedlove's opinion, the first thing that has to happen is the leadership of the West, to include the United States president, needs to be declaratory. They need to be loud and proud. They need to be on every venue they can with a message in the face of Mr. Putin saying, stop, and you will not win this war. We will ensure it. Oh, by the way, doesn't that sound a little bit like the 1994 Budapest Memorandum? Didn't your great country and my great country assure the uh, uh, the sovereign borders and the sovereignty of Ukraine? So we have a deal. Everybody's talking about we need a deal. We got a deal. I can pull it up right now and read it to you, and it's pretty demonstrative what it tells us we're going to do, and we need to do that.
It's fascinating to listen to you put it so succinctly. You're absolutely right. Um, you, I really liked your point about the Ukrainian military becoming more like NATO, but also NATO becoming more like Ukraine. That was very well put too. The challenge, and I've had this exact conversation with your successor as Sakur. Okay, well, fine. We would love to disinvest in heavy main battle tank in order to transform towards another. And I think that given that, I won't betray his confidence by using his exact response, but the gist of it was that steel is real. We're not talking here about the disinvestment of heavy divisions. Those are still needed for the stop line. All of this transformation is additional. It comes on top. Now, the challenge is that that's expensive. Does any military beyond the United States in Europe have the capacity to both maintain the heavy armor and to add everything else on top?
So 5 times in my life I've been a joint officer. But will you just give me a minute to be an airman? And let me tell you that one of the reasons we find ourselves in this horrible place in Ukraine is because Russian air power has failed and Ukrainian air power never had a chance. I mean, they did magnificently with what they had. They are small and mighty, and I could not be more proud of the airmen in Ukraine, but they never had a chance. Oh, by the way, because we were a part of disarming them. Your country and my country were a part of disarming them. And so, when you have a world superpower air force that cannot establish battlefield air superiority over its own country, its own troops, or the forward projection of its invading force, you end up with what you see now, a regression in warfare back to World War I, attritional, linear kind of fighting, which is just horrid. And like I said, I can't speak for Great Britain. I just can't. But here's what I can speak for. In the United States, we lost 58,000 soldiers in 10 years in Vietnam. Russia has lost over a million. And that's the conservative numbers. There are higher numbers. Most are around 1.1, but there are bigger numbers. And it's already affecting Russia. They can't man their industries. They're having to bring North Koreans in to man their industries. They can't fight their front line. They had to bring North Koreans in to retake sovereign Russian territory. And even with 30,000 North Koreans, they haven't retaken all of the sovereign Russian territory that Ukraine stopped. So you got this army that is attritionally losing, in my position. They're gaining minuscule, less than 0.69 of 1% of Ukraine land they've gained in the last year, and they've lost over a million total, but some say 400,000 in that effort. This is unsustainable. I don't care how much you think Russia can suffer. This is unsustainable. They can't run their own industries. They can't defend their own land and retake their own land. They've been run out of the northern Black Sea. Their air force will not fly deeply into Ukraine. All they can do is shoot missiles, hundreds and thousands of missiles. And so this is not an army that's winning. It's an army, in my mind, that's losing, and it's a matter of time. Can they hold on long enough for the West to cave? That's what they're waiting for. That's what they're driving for, is that the West caves and gives them what they can't take. All right, I'll stop, but one last point. Remember, in about 3 sets of demands ago, because every time we try to do something peaceful, try to arrange a peace, Russia's asks get higher. About 3 asks ago, they made the point, you have to give us all of the 4 Donbass, or all of the 4 oblasts that we have been invading in. They can't take it. They're counting on the West to give it to them. I mean, does this sound like an army that's winning? Not to me.
No, I mean, and it's demonstrably not. They are well into their fourth, arguably fifth echelon. They've had to call for North Korean reinforcements, and the bit that I
Twice.
find, well, indeed, and the thing that I find particularly baffling is, given how the Kremlin have this constant anxiety that NATO is in fact an offensive alliance, it's not, and is ready to sort of seize Russian territory at the first opportunity, they're now in a place where they have got an entirely amateur conscript army and a hugely degraded inventory against NATO's first echelon. And so strategically, they have brought on themselves the biggest imbalance in conventional forces on the European continent since, I don't know, since before the turn of the 20th century.
So again, James, let me just throw one complicating factor in there. So I agree with your assessment, but I don't know if you've ever read, in when we go to war college in the military, we study these people. We call them the old dead guys: Clausewitz, Jomini, and Sun Tzu. And Jomini was the one that talked about this theory of internal lines, and what Russia enjoys in its fight against the West in Europe is incredibly magnificent internal lines. If you look at Moscow and you see the spider work of major highways and rail, which is really how the Russian army moves, is on rail. They have this incredible spider work aimed to the West. So why do I bring this up? Even this much depleted, much more amateur army can go over to the Pskov part of Russia and be right there on the borders of our Baltic nations and enjoy the ability of what Jomini called internal lines to rapidly focus combat power and give us things to worry about. So we have things we have to worry about. And my pride in what started with us is that since the invasion of Crimea and since the invasion of the Donbass, NATO has been slowly, in my opinion, too slowly, but they have been positively and slowly increasing readiness, increasing the forward deployment, and doing the things that are going to be required to hopefully deter Russia from such foolishness, but if not, to be able to fight in the face of what Jomini describes as internal lines and the ability to rapidly mass forces because of those internal lines.
So I segues nicely into the sort of final thing I wanted to get your thoughts on. As you've mentioned, you're an Air Force general. It strikes me that of all of the domains, or the traditional domains, I think space is every bit as technologically demanding, but air is the most technologically demanding and expensive. Um, and I had a very interesting conversation with the Deputy Supreme Allied Commander, who viewers will will be interesting. He sort of looks after the kind of force generation and the sort of sustainability of the force. And my question to him was, look, if we've got this incredibly high-tech exchange in the air, particularly in the first 6 weeks of the war, and stockpiles across the alliance are largely expended at the end, even if we were able to generate the manufacturing to then to thereafter be able to produce at the rate of firing, it doesn't seem to me that we have the sea and air lines of communication with which to bring the rare earths and the semiconductors and everything else that are so important for those complex weapon systems. And so is there an inherent unsustainability in the air fight as we envisage it, because we just don't have access to the raw materials that are needed for complex weapon systems once we're into the fight?
You just said the most important thing in the last three sentences. The air fight as we envisage it. The air fight so far in Ukraine is one of the biggest failed policies of the West of anything I've seen in my adult time as an airman commander, etc. We have hamstrung Ukraine. We have we have made Russia capable. We have enabled them, if you think like in the terms of alcoholism or something. We have been an enabler to Russia in the following way. We have allowed Russia to fire all the way from Belarus, all the way around through Russia, all the way down through the Black Sea. We've allowed Russia to fire into Ukraine from anywhere they wanted to fire. We gave them what many call sanctuary to fight from, and we forbid for years, and even today to a certain degree, we forbid Ukraine from using our kit to fire back. So Ukraine's had to develop its own kit in the main to be able to fire back into Russia. This would be like asking Roger Federer to go to the French Open and declare, I will receive serve for the entire match championship. I'm going to say that personal pronoun one more time. We have put Ukraine in a horrible place. We have told them, you must continue to get pounded. We're going to allow Russia to pound you, and you cannot fire back. It's just absurd. It's multiple administrations, it's multiple leaderships. It's this approach to warfare is absurd, and it demonstrates a lack of understanding of warfare. And so one of the things that is needed first and foremost here is a change in policy. You know, all of these now hundreds and thousands of bombs that are hitting into Ukraine every night. We can't build enough air defense to stop it all. If you're trying to shoot the arrows, you will forever be behind both in military application and in cost. We have got to give Ukraine the ability to kill the archer and kill the production capabilities of the archer and turn these things off. So until we make a fundamental change in, as you said, the concept of this air fight, we're not going to be able to turn this around. Mr. Putin sits back there and he's like, hey, I'm good. America has forbidden them. The West has forbidden them. They can't shoot at me. I'm good. We'll bring in the Chinese. We got Chinese and North Koreans and others in there helping build this. Iranians at one point were in Crimea. And, you know, everybody's coming because they can't shoot back at us until they develop their own tools to do it. And that, James, is the most important change in this war, I think, necessary. The West has, and oh, by the way, let's just look at it. What the few things that Ukraine has shot at in Russia, all military targets, all military targets. The numbers are being crunched, but what is Russia shooting at in Ukraine? Almost entirely civil targets. We call that counter force versus counter value. Ukraine is fighting a counter force fight, trying to tear apart the military capability of Russia. Russia's just trying to destroy Ukraine and its people, the concept of the country.
So we should be drawing the conversation to a close, but if you'll indulge me, I can't resist asking you. Um, I think that, well, I know because I was involved in the conversations. We were constantly calibrating around two things. So, firstly, the UK pushed and pushed to be able to fire things like Storm Shadow into Russia, but the Biden administration were happy enough for us to do that with our systems, but very clear they did not want to start World War III, and that it was kind of on us to make sure that didn't happen. And then the conversation that was even more earnest was around where the nuclear threshold is. And I wonder if the Ukrainians don't go after civilian critical national infrastructure because they think that's a threshold around tactical nuclear use.
I don't agree with you there. I think the Ukrainians, because of the way that we have limited them, both in policy and in giving them the kit, they are using the what we give them to affect what's affecting them the most. They're going after bombers, they're going after production facilities, they're going after fuel, all of those things that generate Russia's ability to attack Ukraine. They're running with a very limited policy and a very limited set of kit. They're running a pretty good counterforce campaign, because that's what they worry about, is the continually striking of their people. Russia, because they are enabled by the West and because they are outfitted by China, North Korea, and Iran, they are about disassembling the will and the nation of Ukraine. And so we have to be big enough to step up. And may I just say one more thing? There are those in the West that you hit both of the hot buttons, the World War III and nukes. This is, have you ever heard of reflexive control? This is a Russian concept. Look up reflexive control. They are running an incredibly good reflexive control campaign, and it is deterring the leadership of the West. If you look back across the history of this last phase of this long war, about every 8 to 10 days, somebody at the highest levels, not Lavrov and up, but just below Lavrov and up, in somebody in Russia talks about nukes. And the last time that Putin had a big speech, he said, "Well, I hope we can finish this war without using nuclear weapons." So they keep a constant battle rhythm of scaring the West, and we in the West are scared, and we are deterred is the more appropriate word. But this reflexive control campaign of where this means World War III. They said more than once, if Ukraine invades Russia, it's World War III. Have we had World War III? There's still Ukrainians in Russia. Okay, so I think in the West, we, at least in my history, we had John F. Kennedy that figured out how to handle a problem when he was threatened with nukes. We had Ronnie Reagan, who figured out how to handle a problem when he was threatened with nukes. I think in the West, need to show the world that we can fight when people threaten us with nukes. Or you could expect every little rogue power to try to get a nuke that he can, because he can say, "Look, I can move the West around like a checker on the checkerboard." And we need to show Mr. Putin and others in this world that we have a military that has a capability, and there is more to this than your reflexive control campaign.
Philip, what a fantastic conversation. I'm so grateful to you for joining us. Superpowers is watched widely on both sides of the Atlantic, but I really hope that people in Congress and in the Central Policy Department in the DoD hear your exposition in this episode, and particularly your theory of victory, that this isn't going to happen by just by willing it. You've actually got to to act and support the Ukrainians. I couldn't agree more with what you've said. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm James Heapy. This is Superpowers, the future of global security here on Times Radio. For more of Times Radio's brilliant geopolitical content, make sure you subscribe to the YouTube channel. But for now, see you next week. Thanks.